Hi everyone, welcome back to Useful Genetics. This is Lecture 9I, where we're going to talk about the problems that inbreeding creates for endangered species. We'll talk about the distinction between inbred and outbred species and how the latter have mechanisms to prevent inbreeding. However, these don't work well when the populations get very small. We'll talk about how captive breeding programs, breeding animals in zoos, have kept track of their pedigrees in hopes of compensating for inevitable losses of genetic diversity. So some species are naturally inbred. This is true mostly for some plants, which either obligatorily or frequently self-pollinate. Peanuts are a good example. You might think that these species would suffer inbreeding depression, but they don't, partly because inbreeding depression is a transient phenomenon. In the inbred mice I described, the researchers culled the breeding population of mice that were less fit. In nature, natural selection will do the same thing, and provided the transition to inbreeding isn't too severe, the species won't go extinct as a consequence. But once a species is established as self-pollinating, any new harmful recessive mutations that arise quickly become homozygous and are eliminated by natural selection before they can become established in the population. Each plant is homozygous, but the species isn't. The species can have a great deal of genetic diversity, typically as much genetic diversity as an outbred population. Most sexual species are outbred. They have not just by chance, they have mechanisms that have evolved to increase the likelihood that the two gametes will come from unrelated parents. In plants, there are biochemical barriers that say that a plant's pollen can't fertilize its own ovule, or timing mechanisms that ensure that the pollen isn't ready for fertilization at the same time as the egg. Plants also have gamete dispersal mechanisms, wind or insect pollination. In animals, the mating types themselves serve as a barrier to close inbreeding. You have to be males and females. And there are behavioral mechanisms. For instance, in many territorial species, one sex or the other of the offspring leaves the natal territory where they were born, and this dispersal promotes outbreeding. However, these mechanisms fail when species become critically endangered and their population sizes become very small. And the result is that there is inbreeding and there is inbreeding depression. The fitness of these individuals in these populations can be very low. It's not just that some individuals are homozygous for harmful mutations. Sometimes the recessive harmful alleles may become fixed in the population, established as the only allele that's present. This inbreeding depression reduces the overall fitness of the individuals in the population, but it also reduces the amount of variation in the population that would allow it to cope with changes in its environment, in particular with new pathogens or parasites. I've got a couple of examples of the consequences of inbreeding for fitness. This is data for two species, a gazelle, the mohair gazelle, and the Iberian lynx. And the researchers measured heterozygosity. That's the easiest way to get an estimate of the amount of inbreeding in an animal's history. When you don't know their genetic history, you simply test how many of their alleles are heterozygous and how many are homozygous. And what they found was that as heterozygosity went up, animals with higher heterozygosity had more normal spermatozoa. It turns out that sperm quality is a particularly sensitive phenotype, particularly sensitive to homozygosity, to inbreeding depression. And the same was true in the gazelle. Individuals with more heterozygosity had more normal sperm. It's interesting to notice that in the gazelle population, all the individuals had more than 50% normal sperm, but the lynx, none of the individuals had as much as 50% normal sperm, suggesting that the lynx population is in more trouble, even though the actual heterozygosity measures were not very different. Another set of data comes from black rhinoceroses in Africa. Rhinoceroses typically range over large territories, but they found that the animals with higher heterozygosity, now this graph is backwards, that's heterozygosity. That's homozygosity. This direction is increasing heterozygosity. Animals with higher heterozygosity had substantially larger home ranges, which is likely to be a predictor of their overall fitness and ability to survive and reproduce. Now, these problems mean that when endangered species are brought into zoos and are used in captive breeding programs, it's critically important to pay attention to the pedigrees of the animals that are being bred, to minimize any additional inbreeding, and to maximize the preservation of whatever genetic diversity remains in the populations. So here's a pedigree for a snake, the endangered Jamaican boa. It's pretty hard to understand, but I'll call you attention to, even though these are conservation geneticists and they know inbreeding is undesirable, there are still cases of breeding between sibling pairs within the captive breeding program. Sometimes that's all the individuals that are available to you. Here's an even more complicated pedigree diagram. These are, if you only look up here, you might say, oh, that looks kind of like the kind of pedigree diagram we might see in a genetics problem. But as soon as you move down into the breeding program, it gets extremely complicated. These are African wild dogs in a large number of zoos all over the world. I think there was something like 150 zoos and about 700 different dogs in these zoos. And the animals are transported from one zoo to another to promote outcrossing, to promote the genetic health of the captive breeding population as a whole, so that the animals within a zoo are not in general allowed to spend very much time breeding with each other. So what we've done, we've talked about inbred and outbred populations. We've talked about mechanisms that have evolved to prevent inbreeding and how they fail in critically small populations. The consequence is inbreeding, which can further causes inbreeding depression, which further endangers the species, worsening its chances of survival. And captive breeding programs have to take drastic steps to maintain the genetic diversity that exists in the breeding program. Coming up next, we're going to stop talking about inbreeding and move in the other direction, talking about hybrids. And we're going to start with hybrids within a species, of which the best example probably is hybrid corn, maize to everyone except you Americans. Hope to see you there.